Hi, guys. Your favorite pseudo intellectual here, with who is now a recurrent character in the Archiverse, and my most distinguished guest, Profesor. I'm your host, Lord Hellespont V, and it's really a pleasure to welcome back our man in Geneva, back from Geneva. How are you, Professor?
Very good. Thank you for having me, Lord. Always, always a pleasure to see you.
As always, the pleasure is mine. So you have had a little trip to the land of milk and chocolate and luxury watches, and I think you had a very interesting glimpse into the state of the luxury watch industry. What were some of your impressions?
Obviously, what I received from most of the people I spoke to, which involves the world of watches, but also finance, and both of them go together, finance and watches. Um, is that there is obviously a concern about what's happening outside of the borders of Switzerland, which, of course, Switzerland gets impacted, and that's the global economic situation. It's unavoidable to be concerned, and all of them in Switzerland are concerned. Whether they're heavily concerned or not, that's a different question. But always, when there is a downward move and mood, and when financial markets dive and sink, and when there is chatter and concern about a recession, whether it's a deep or a shallow one, um, of course it impacts everybody, and it impacts the watch industry. Um, of course, we should not exaggerate, because I think there is a tendency to exaggerate between what we see now in the gray market chatter that prices have gone down, which obviously they have gone down. You have to remember that the watch industry takes a long term view of things. So whenever I hear people saying, oh, this company is going to increase production, or they're building this new expansion, I always tell them that, look, these companies tend to be closed stock companies. However, they do make announcements, and Rolex has not made an announcement that they're expanding. So it's interesting to see that there is this perpetual myth that somehow um, Rolex is expanding its production. And it's not expanding because they take the long term view. So, for instance, if there is a recession like the one we're going into,
Mhm.
there will be less demand. And that is something that they need to be mindful of. Having said that,
I
over the,
want
yes.
to I want to ask, maybe two more questions related to this, because on the one hand, like you said, let's put things in perspective. Because after all, the Swiss watch industry, along with many different segments of other elite luxury brands, has really been riding on the crest of a wave these last few years, and perhaps uh, through the pandemic, there has been a surprising, if not entirely unexpected, rise in the consumption of luxury goods, including wristwatches. So they have, in fact, gone through perhaps some of the most flourishing, maybe condensed periods in their recent history. Um, that being said, of course, I have to take responsibility for perpetuating some of those rumors, because I keep hearing these things, and sometimes I don't know any better. It was my understanding that Rolex was, in fact, building a certain kind of annex, at least, if not necessarily a new facility. But of course, I stand connected. I stand corrected, and it does make sense, actually, considering how Rolex always moves, either rather pleasantly at a steady pace or at a glacial pace, if you take it from a negative perspective. So it doesn't really surprise me that they're not gonna shift gears, not that they should, to respond to any spike in demand. But at any rate, like you said, the demand might be falling in the short term. But isn't there already a lot of backlog, a lot of demand from the last few years that they need to catch up to, that they need to make up for in terms of the supply?
Right. It's a very good question. So this is where I was going. One needs to differentiate. I was going to say this. One, between brands, uh, and secondly, address the issue between gray market and production market, which is at the level of the manufacturer. So whatever is going on at the gray market is not necessarily representing what's happening at the manufacturer. So just because gray market prices are going down, it doesn't mean that a watch company is going to change its production. Having said that, the opposite is also true. Just because there is demand increasing, it doesn't mean that Rolex is going to produce, just because people want to, another 2 million watches, and Audemars is going to increase by 30,000, and Patek is just going to go on. They do increase, obviously. They do have long-term plans to increase production, and all of them have done it. Patek has done it, Audemars has done it, Rolex has done it. But I will ask people to watch the announcements of Rolex. The last time they did a substantial expansion to their production was in 2012. So there is no annex next to a building where they're going to add another 500,000 just because Bob, Smith, and Jake decided that this is the next thing Rolex should do. And one needs to also remember that they need to differentiate between brands. The policy of Rolex is not the same as Patek. They're two very excellent brands, but they're diametrically very different brands. So the watch world is not, we try to generalize. So what is happening to demand? Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes, I'm just reading also the comment. Demand, there is a backlog for sure, for many years. What happens is that this backlog, in times such as these, gets impacted and restructured. So all these people who have gone to their ADs and put down 6 watches that they want to get, and the pattern was that over the last 2 years they would get half a watch and then spend a lot of money and get maybe a bracelet, and then in the second year maybe they're lucky to get something, or they bribe their ADs, or the ADs are bribable, also that, and they get something. That's a different question, but demand gets restructured. So people are people and they panic, and people have a tendency to panic and to be greedy. So in the days of the 12-year rally we witnessed, to what you said, people were greedy, and the more people talked about watches, and the more you and others talked about the brands, the more it was a self-perpetuating demand obsession that fed into this beast, and that continued. Now all of this is going to change because look, people are going to get unemployed, demand will fall for goods, stock markets are crashing, and even the wealthy people will have to reconsider. Mind you, Rolex is not a brand for just the high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals. Most academic studies done on luxury goods prove the point that luxury goods are consumed by aspirational consumers, people who want to be rich but they're not rich. People who want to show success, so they wear, at different levels. A guy who's making certain money would
Yeah.
go and buy, let's say, the Rolex, the Omega. A guy who
That's
is above that will
that, that's
buy.
that's certainly the case with me. I'm absolutely and utterly broke, and I have all these Rolex watches because I want to show off. But there's a very good question here by Captain Kirk that can help us also
Yeah,
address the gray market situation. And I think this is something we can unpack as we transition to Archie Luxury live stream from here. But of course, the prices have already started dipping, 10, sometimes 20% when it comes to overhyped models and particular kinds of watches. But really, we are predicting, not necessarily foreseeing, right? This is not investment advice, that the prices will continue to dip for some time, let's say until the end of the year. And Captain Kirk asks, if prices drop enough, how necessary is the gray market? Many don't have the watch on site as it is. He means, sometimes gray market dealers just post a stock photo for a watch they will supposedly get for the customer. What do you think about this situation? How much do you think this proliferation of gray market dealers in social media in the last few years, they have literally spread like mushrooms? How will they be affected, and will there be a place for them in the midterm in the watch market?
yeah. One needs to recognize that the gray market has fueled a lot of this craziness in the watch world, and in many ways, it has helped, but also damaged watch brands.
Hmm.
Because the gray market price doesn't benefit the company, the manufacturer. It benefits whoever. But also it creates a noise because a brand like Patek will tell you, I cannot sell you the Nautilus, but go off and buy a Calatrava. And it's wonderful to have a Calatrava. But why pay $30,000 for a watch that says the time, the seconds, and has a date? You can do that with an Omega very well. And probably you can dive with it and not be worried. So, the brands who were able, including Rolex, to offset a lot of the pressure they had on the more expensive pieces. You would go to an AD and you would tell him, listen, I want this watch, the steel one. And he would say, no, I don't have it, but go and buy the yellow gold. And they will be out of precious metal watches. Now, gray market, I think a lot of the influencers will disappear. They'll have to find another job, because in times of recession, people are going to be less concerned about getting the latest upside down GMT Rolex, or the Air King, and I suspect that in times of recession, manufacturers do produce less eloquent and costly watches than during times of opulence. So I would expect next year and the year after, if we continue this difficult moment in economics and economic history, a lot of the watchmakers will not produce. The gray market is going to change as well. A lot of them will disappear. A lot of them who pretend to be aficionados, and on the back end of that, they sell watches and they wear them and then sell them. It's going to come to an end because now a lot of them have expensive watches. They cannot sell them. And I'll tell you why. I think the question refers to that in some ways. If I remember, it was Kermit. If you're expecting Lord for prices, and I think you said it as well and others, there is a perfect impact with what you say happening. If you're expecting prices to decline, what happens to demand? If you are postponing a major economic decision for a bit later, it means that prices are going to fall even further. And if there is a generalized trend, that means that prices are going to fall really big time. So if you're saying, hey, I'm putting off the purchase of my watch for maybe December, beginning of 23, because either it's in the gray market and that price is going to decline, or I'll have accessibility and maybe a discount from my AD, and he'll give it to me without having to buy all this garbage. For sure, what will happen is that the decline is going to be steeper and demand is going to fall. So there was a comment or a question by another of our viewers, and that person was saying, well, I went to the AD, if I'm correct, and he said, I have a lot of watches. I think now they're getting a lot of watches. And I think by the end of the year, the ADs will have a lot of leftovers. And they'll say, what do I do?
Yeah, I mean, look, in a way, it is a lot of economic behavior, especially in an increasingly interconnected world, can be, like you implied, a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, right? If a lot of us actually end up articulating and propagating this idea of, hey, we are postponing our purchases for a little while until the end of the year, or maybe early February, rather than doing, early 2023, rather than doing unboxing after unboxing. Maybe at least within our little community of watch enthusiasts on YouTube, there might be a certain trickle down effect, but thankfully it is not something that is limited, that's restricted to the luxury watch market. And of course, unfortunately, it is the fallout of a lot of pain and suffering and wars that are going on in the world today. One thing, of course, is this. Again, there has been increasing demand for certain kinds of watches. Rolex certainly has been at the forefront of our conversation. It is the centerpiece a lot of times. And one of our viewers was saying that his authorized dealer, in fact, perhaps received more Rolex watches this year than years before. But you are predicting, in fact, there might be finally some availability before the end of the year, or perhaps early next year, if these trends downward continue accelerating, in fact, downward.
Yes, definitely. I think that first of all, we reached, the watch industry, like many other industries, experienced a bubble. It was a true bubble, but there were other bubbles that were created for the last 12 years. We had a crypto bubble, which kind of burst. We had a stock market bubble, which is bursting and burst. and there is more to come. There was an economic bubble. Probably the housing bubble is going to burst as well in the US. So as a result of all these things happening, um, watches are going to be impacted because they were fed by a lot of liquidity, by a lot of money going around. And then the influencers came in and everybody started, becoming an aficionado, and you would watch all these YouTube things, people with dark glasses talking half of the time nonsense and copying somebody else, doing shows in Miami, doing shows in, I don't know, Las Vegas, talking from their kitchens, their bathrooms, giving themselves funny names and titles. I mean, this is all garbage. Um,
You don't. I mean, you can say it to my face. We are.
no, I'm not referring to you. In fact,
I'm kidding.
I'm sure people, if anybody is conscious, I'm referring to specific people, which are there. Another guy who shows his collection, and it's multi-million collection. Every time I see him in his huge opulent house in the US, he's buying, 3 million, 5 million, 10 million worth of watches. I mean, this has to come to an end with the era of plentiful money. And the industry attracted a lot of people who were neither true collectors, nor were they doing good for those who were collecting for many years before, because immediately you, myself, and others who were collectors, genuine collectors, would go to the AD, and the AD will say, but listen, Mr. Lord, Professor, there is this guy who is above you, and this guy is like a millionaire. And then there is this guy above him who is, a billionaire. And so it went. And we got sidetracked and sidelined. I think this trend is going to change. Now, let's not also exaggerate the downside, meaning that this is not a gloom and doom situation where the watch industry is going to be collapsing. There will be no brands, and entities such as the Swatch Group, Omega, the Richemont, LVMH, Rolex, Patek will disappear. These companies have seen recessions many more times than I have seen, and anybody else has seen.
They have actually pulled through, when we look at the specific of the watch industry, through much darker times. Of course, the quartz crisis comes to mind. But yeah, so that's why I, in the beginning, wanted to put it in perspective. Now, we're starting the Archie Luxury live stream in 5 minutes, so we will continue the conversation there. Guys, I'm posting the link, of course, right here. Don't forget to upvote on your way out. And if you want to support the channel, if you want to encourage me in running these sorts of live streams, having these sorts of interviews, creating more and original content, consider making a contribution on PayPal at lordhellespontv@gmail.com, lordhellespontv@gmail.com. I also have a Cash App, which is $LHVVV, $LHVVV. So guys, click the link, and we will be transitioning very quickly to the Archie Luxury live stream. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your presence and support, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Bye.